How did this comedy manga beat Jujutsu Kaisen? Jujutsu Kaisen ended last year after 271 chapters, but Welcome to Demon School Iruma-kun is still going strong after 44 volumes and over 400 chapters. Granted, Jujutsu Kaisen has sold more units, but it started in March of 2018 and is already over, while Iruma-kun started a year before and could go on for at least 2 more years. Plus, Iruma-kun has not 1, not 2, but 3 manga spin-offs. So if you're new to Iruma-kun, you're probably wondering how it outlived a series like Jujutsu Kaisen and why people love this series. So in this video, I'd like to share my first impression of the manga after binging all 400 chapters, discuss the weird trend of comedy manga beating action manga, and explain why Iruma-kun is one of the most underrated manga ever. So first, you're probably wondering, what is Iruma-kun? Well, as you can imagine, Welcome to Demon School Iruma-kun is about Iruma. He's a human that gets sold by his parents to a powerful demon lord who just wants to adopt him as his grandson. Now that he lives in the demon world, Iruma has to go to school with a bunch of demons and hide the fact that he's a human. And to make matters worse, unlike all these scary demons, Iruma is a major pushover who does anything you tell him as long as you say please. As you can tell, Iruma naturally plays out like a lot of comedy manga. With each new chapter, Iruma has to overcome some absurd obstacle at demon school, whether it's learning to summon a familiar or having to fight the other students. So really, it's a magic school action comedy, which on paper sounds like Iruma-kun just mixes a bunch of different stuff together, but it's really not that complicated. It's really a lot like Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball started out as a comedy, and while it always included big fights, it never really became an action series until much later in the story. With Iruma-kun, it's kind of a fantasy comedy. It's certainly not a gag comedy like Roboco, but it's a bit more casual than something like Gintama. Funny enough, that's not that different from how Jujutsu Kaisen started. When JJK started out, you never heard people saying, oh, it's pure hype, oh, it's all fights. It was like all the other big shonen. It was clearly an action series, but it had plenty of comedy elements as well. Ouji was a goofy character, Gojo was the strongest character, but he was almost never serious. Ouji, Megumi, and Nobara had that Team 7 sort of vibe. It was an Exorcist type story, but it was also pretty lighthearted. But the biggest difference between Jujutsu Kaisen and Iruma-kun is scope. Jujutsu Kaisen opens with a very clear end goal, stopping the return of Sukuna. Iruma-kun, on the other hand, doesn't have that. Iruma-kun kinda touches on a bunch of different genres and tropes, but doesn't have an explicit end goal. But this means that the author doesn't have a bunch of expectations, which has allowed him to write so many different arcs. But real quick, before I say more on that, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You get custom badges and emojis to show off during our weekly live streams, and you can pick which series I cover next. Now, I said in my last video how the big problem with Jujutsu Kaisen was planning, and that's pretty clear if you know anything about Jujutsu Kaisen. It starts off with a clear premise, and that carries you to Shibuya. But after Shibuya is when you start to get that feeling that Akutami really hadn't planned out the rest of the story. Pulling games while fun is just another battle royale, and then that leaves you with the final arc. And while the final arc has its peaks, it clearly wasn't that well planned, and it all boils down to the overall structure of Jujutsu Kaisen, namely that it didn't really have one. Actually, it did have an overall arc, but the first half was clearly more planned out than the later half. And I don't know how true this is, but supposedly Akutami never really planned out the story that much from the beginning. Considering he never planned to keep the story going after JJK 0, that would make sense. And this is where you run into that problem of Jujutsu Kaisen is all fights and nothing else. Nobody says that about Bleach or Naruto or One Piece. The reason is because those stories have carefully structured arcs that ultimately come together to form one coherent story. Meanwhile, with Jujutsu Kaisen, it starts off really strong and is still good in the later chapters, but there's a clear difference between the first half and the second half. And for the sake of comparison, let me bring up another series with this problem, The Promised Neverland. The Promised Neverland has one of the best first arcs in any manga, and it also has Goldie Pond, one of the most universally adored arcs. But all those people who got hooked on the manga back in the day will tell you that the story kinda falls off in the second half. And I think part of the problem is the nature of these kinds of stories. It seems like, especially with battle shonen or thrillers, writers will have amazing ideas in the beginning, but they don't think about how to adapt that idea over time. And the thing about action is it's very entertaining, but if you don't mix up the formula or flesh things out over time, people are either going to get bored or they're going to wonder why they're not seeing more in the story. And this is why Jujutsu Kaisen is only 271 chapters and Irumakun is over 400 chapters, because Irumakun changes over time. It starts out kind of like a weekly gag series, but over time it adds more structure to the story. So it starts out with Irumakun making friends at school. Then there's an arc where one of the kids at school is secretly working for the big bad of the series. After this arc, Iruma actually starts to grow and gains a serious motivation. At the same time, the story never veers away from its roots and occasionally throws in those kinds of chapters that are just self-contained stories. Fast forward to the current story, and now Iruma is one of the candidates for the next king of the demon world, and there's this secret plot to expose Iruma and start a revolution. Mind you, there were seeds of this stuff planted in the beginning, but like we talked about, that's not what Iruma was about in the very beginning. And yet, series creator Osamu Nishi slowly builds up to the more serious parts of the story after they've already shown all the crazy characters. Another advantage to this approach is that because we've spent plenty of time with characters when they're just hanging out in class, they actually feel like real members of the cast by the time we get to those serious arcs. Meanwhile, another big complaint people have about the end of Jujutsu Kaisen is that certain characters never lived up to their full potential. And part of that is because Jujutsu Kaisen is an action series, and so it doesn't spend nearly as much time fleshing out the characters in these slice-of-life type moments. Now, I should be fair, it's not like comedy stories like Irumakun follow this perfect formula that works all the time. Just as one example, a lot of people didn't like the later chapters in Komi-san. It's funny because Komi-san is a rom-com, and while this led to the more serious arcs, or in this case, more plot-focused arcs, Komi-san makes it very clear that it's structured like a gag manga. In the beginning of the manga, a lot of the chapters are self-contained stories, and anything that isn't lasts maybe 2 chapters tops. But once you've had a bunch of the more serious arcs, like whenever Komi has to fight for Tadano later in the story, these gag chapters kind of lose people. And yet that's exactly what Komi-san was doing from the very beginning. So in that case, Komi-san seems to contradict everything I've said about Iruma in the sense that comedy manga don't always beat action manga. But these manga aren't the same at all. The difference is that Komi-san, not unlike Jujutsu Kaisen, starts out with an explicit end goal, getting 100 friends. It then evolves like Irumakun as it leans more into the romance elements and offers what's close to serious arcs, but it still has that end goal, so that's where you fall back into the gag chapters. The only real premise of Irumakun in the beginning is, hey, watch Iruma survive demon school. The story never has this strict structure that people expect it to follow, and so Nishi has the freedom to shift the direction of the story with each new arc. And that's how Irumakun is able to beat a manga like Jujutsu Kaisen in the long term. Speaking of which, that brings up an important argument I'm sure a lot of people are going to share, but before that I should address one small concern, namely the publishers. These are all series published in magazines, and so how long they go on for is heavily influenced by the editors in charge. Personally, this is why I feel like Rent a Girlfriend is still going on, because after reading the whole manga, I can tell you that story should have ended like 2 years ago, but it's a popular rom-com and people keep reading that manga and its spin-off, so that's how a series like Rent a Girlfriend can reach 400 chapters, while a series like Jujutsu Kaisen ends short of 300 chapters. But let's go back to this idea of long-term. I brought up the idea that Irumakun beats Jujutsu Kaisen in the long term, but this gets us into the discussion of what success looks like for a manga, because plenty of big manga never hit 300 chapters. Jujutsu Kaisen was 271 chapters, and it's one of the best-selling manga of all time. Demon Slayer is only 205 chapters, and it sold even more volumes. So you can argue this idea that you have to reach over 300 chapters in order to be successful is completely bogus. And I agree to an extent. Clearly, you don't need to be as long as One Piece to be popular and sell volumes. In fact, you probably won't see a lot more new manga go past 300 chapters. But for every Jujutsu Kaisen and Demon Slayer, there's a bunch of other series that end after 4 or 5 years and never get nearly as popular. But when you give a series more time to grow, it usually leads to massive success. For example, when Dandadan started, it was popular, but it really only had a small following, and people claimed it didn't really have a story. Fast forward to 2025, and it's one of the most popular anime, and the manga has one of the most carefully structured stories out of any ongoing series. You could even say the same is happening to Nue's Exorcist. When that series started, nobody really talked about it. I thought it was only a matter of time before it got cut. But over the last couple of years, I've seen fans consistently recommend the manga. Now it's close to 100 chapters, and I wouldn't be surprised if it even got an anime. So here's what I'm getting at. Obviously, sales matter, but there's something to be said about stories that start with humble beginnings and value long-term growth. One of the best examples of this is JoJo. Each part is only like 200 chapters, but that's one of the longest ongoing manga that still follows basically the same story. But as any JoJo fan will tell you, the beauty of JoJo is that each part does something new. Basically, the story adapts over time. Araki values the long-term growth of the series, and as a result, JoJo is one of the longest and best-selling manga of all time. So while wowing people early on can lead to massive success, the overwhelming trend with successful stories seems to be a balance of thoughtful planning and adaptability. And this is exactly what Iruma-kun does. It starts out like just another comedy series, but has one of the most carefully built up stories out of any ongoing manga. At the same time, it's still the same chill fantasy series that we read about 400 chapters ago. So while it might not have the all-time best sales, this is why anyone who reads Iruma-kun will tell you that it's one of the all-time best manga. But maybe I'm wrong. How would you rate Iruma-kun? How does it compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get exclusive badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get credited in future videos. Also check out my other manga videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.